Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 6th of July. Today we're looking at important changes on the Vovcha riverfront. We'll also look at, of course, New York and Toretsk, where we have important updates. Spirne was actually captured, so we'll look at that. We'll also look at the situation around novomykhailiva on the Luhansk Front, which we covered a few times recently. And of course, we'll finish off by looking at Vovchansk. So we're going to begin by taking a look here at confirmation essentially of the Russian capture of Syrskyi, which we knew about for a couple of days now based on Ukrainian reporting. But now we have this video from the 15th Motorized Brigade, one of the main units involved in the actual capture of the village. They raised the flag in the western portion of the village. And then we have confirmation that the Russians have continued pushing along nearby paths based on a video from the strike drone company of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. And they are filmed here striking a Russian soldier that was firing towards an FPV, and the FPV hit him. Again, you have Russian soldiers, lone infantry squads, not really vehicles, actually infiltrating into Volskod, which is now under Russian control. And you have avdiivka. I don't know if it's under their full control, but it is basically an extension of the road through Syrskyi. And so the more important part is what's going on with the two defensive structures to the west, because from a Ukrainian perspective, they would have to hold on to it for as long as possible just to buy time for the defenses that are being built hastily now in the region around Vovcha and Pokrovsk, which is just so important because it's the defense not just against the Russian vector directly to the east of Vovcha, where I have this red vector pointing, but it's also defense against the Russian very important, very strong, momentous force that is occurring along the rail line over here. And so you have these two vectors, and they could potentially unify and just get greater magnitude along the Pokrovsk Vovcha area, and you don't have a large concentration of Ukrainian defenses built over here compared to areas further south that are essentially parallel to the Vovcha River. So here you have the density of the Ukrainian defenses near these two villages, and it is rather low, and so the Ukrainians will want to buy time in order to build it up as much as possible. Another issue is that the Vovcha River is really non-existent in this area. It doesn't really bisect the two villages in any substantive way, and so that's not really a thinking for the Russian side when advancing. And so they could just continue with their momentum. They're only 1 kilometer away from these various villages, and then they would also have a means by which to undermine the rest of the Vovcha River line. And so it is very concerning from a Ukrainian standpoint. Looking further south, we see that the Russian forces are taking advantage of the capture of Volskod to try to flank Novomykhailiva Persha, not just from the north directly, but also from this sort of northwestern direction, perhaps to try to cut off any sort of supply line, get closer to the supply lines that the Ukrainians do have into the village. And so it was in advance of about 2 kilometers southwards. And now, again, you have pressure coming from the east, from Novopokrovsk, but way more so from the northern direction. And so it's really a matter of time before this village ends up falling. But a very similar story to Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians do want to maintain control here for as long as possible. And so that's why they do have certain elements of brigades like 68th Jaeger, and we won't get into too much detail because it's all on the map here. But these particular units are sending in some elements to maintain control over here for the time being. And that's all being done in order to buy time for the Ukrainians to solidify control along this ridge where you have all these trenches built just west of the Vovcha River. Nothing new in that regard. Looking at the Toretsk front, I want to begin by talking about the unit composition because we finally have a more detailed overview of the order of battle, which I think will clarify some things and then raise questions about how the Russians were even able to advance and secure breakthroughs in such a fortified area in the first place. So now we have on the Horlivka, New York sort of axis and the sort of salient that the Russians created. We know that there's a general presence of the Skala battalion, which we'll get into in detail. We also know that the 41st Mechanized Brigade is operating here, and based on social media posts and news articles, they have been here since around June 20th, just late June period. That's when they first made their presence known here. And it is important because the 41st Brigade was originally operating around the chasiv region, I guess northwest of Bakhkmut is the best way to put it. And so they had experience in the region that's pretty close to Toretsk, and then at least some of their elements were moved over the past 2-3 months to the Kupyansk front to stabilize the line over there. And now it appears that they've been sent to this region over here. And so the rumor that is swirling right now is that the plan by the Ukrainians was to conduct a certain troop rotation wherein the 24th Brigade, which is a brigade that's now operating around Chasiv, would be moved out of its duty in the Toretsk front and replaced by the 41st Brigade. I don't know if the 41st Brigade was always slated to come to New York and rotate in the place of 24th Brigade, or if it was only moved after the 24th Brigade was moved to Chasiv and then the Russians saw the opportunity and then pounced on it. I don't know which one of the two options are correct, but in any case, it doesn't really change the underlying dynamics of there not being enough men here in the first place for such an important part of the front line that right now, based on the salience that the Russians have created, is actually 35 kilometers wide, you could say, from the southernmost point near Alexandropol all the way to the north to where the canal is located. And so that is a very broad front line, and it could be shortened if all these various salients that are now created, whether it be over here or here, are closed. So it isn't entirely accurate, but even if it was 20 kilometers, having only 41st Brigade accompanied by smaller battalions and regiments is nowhere near enough for such a strategically important city in Donbass. But let's look at some of the other units that are present here. 28th Brigade we know about, they were moved in pretty quickly. 109th Territorial Defense Brigade, they should be around here. That's at least what we knew from before even the Russians began their attacks here. And they would mainly be situated in the area around New York or further south around Alexandropol, but we just haven't heard from them. And so this raises questions about whether on paper the Ukrainians may have a certain amount of men, but if that actually has a tangible impact, if they're not actually involved in the minutiae of the fighting. And then you can see the same thing about some other units that are operating around here, like 2nd National Guard Brigade. We haven't heard much from them. Of course, they could be operating and they just don't release footage, but we have to really get proof of that. We don't have any yet. And then same thing with some of these smaller rifle battalions, for instance. But looking further north, we also know that the 95th Brigade has been moved into this area. This is interesting because this is an air assault unit which has had its battalion split between so many different places, because this is one of those units that roams around to help fill and plug any gaps in the Ukrainian line. And so it did that around Spirne and the Luhansk Front. That's one place. Also, around Charatina for a certain period of time, but in a much smaller extent, probably company-sized formations there. And then also around Maryinka, there was the very important defensive works conducted by this unit to repel Russian assaults for months upon months, at least by one of its battalions to help the 79th Brigade. And so it was very active in those urban battles. Eventually, they lost Maryinka, and then I had proof, but I can't find it, that it was also operating around novomykhailiva, probably the same battalion that was fighting in Maryinka previously. And now it seems like it's just been fully moved here to sort of solidify the line. And so we'll get to that later on. In the one other unit that's operating here is the Hertz Regiment. And as you can see how the Ukrainians, they did try to look for units that are generally known for plugging holes and being moved around a lot. And so that's what they tried doing here. But again, you look at it, 95th Brigade had basically forces committed in important part of the front line at novomykhailiva. Same thing with Skala. They also were operating previously in novomykhailiva, very active in trying to defend against the Russian advances there. Now both of them have been moved away. And then you could say the same thing about 28th Brigade in Bakhmut, or about basically the 41st in the region around Kupyansk or chasiv, wherever it may be. But regardless, we could see here that the Russian forces have continued to press around the gap that they were able to spot in the Ukrainian line further south around the rail line towards Horlivka and then into New York, which I think is really important because for a long time we talked about the way that the Russians would be able to crack the chestnuts, I guess, of New York, because it is, on paper at least, looks like a very fortified sort of town with so many different fortifications built to its east and west. And so we talked about how the Russian forces would have to conduct this elaborate attack from all across the highway and across these various villages to get control of certain high points. And they were able to sort of navigate around that and really shorten the process of putting pressure on the town through just spotting gaps in the Ukrainian line caused by their manpower issues here and caused by just gradually advancing along certain local heights. And that was enough for them to get control over such a large piece of land in a very quick amount of time. And so at a certain period in time, they were actually able to reach the center of New York, and they were able to advance at 1 kilometer more than what I have the current front line marked as. And so, in terms of their furthest extent of a gain, it was over 5 kilometers northwards, which is really a massive amount in such a dense area of just dense in terms of fortifications. So, here on July 6th, we have a video from the Skala Assault Battalion. They were moved in, and they sent in a Bradley and a squad of 6 infantry to counterattack. So, the Bradley, of course, fired its gun towards the Russian positions in these houses and then dismounted the soldiers, and the soldiers just went house by house clearing it out. And so they were successful in pushing back this initial Russian foray, and in doing so, preventing the complete fall of the town, which would be just a massive blow to Toretsk's southern flank. And so, at least for the very, very short term, they were able to stabilize the line. But that says nothing about Russia's future capacity here, because there's no indication that the Russians are getting pushed out of the salient. And so they will be able to likely solidify control here and then have a forward operating base to begin pushing into New York, albeit perhaps at a slower pace if now there are reinforcements that have been sent in. Here we have a video from July 5th. It's Sappers from Russia's, their 1st Army Corps, the 9th Motor Rifle Regiment, one of the units operating around here, which previously had experience in the Avdiivka region, now fighting just a bit to the east. And so what happened here is just a single Russian soldier continued advancing northwards, spotted a Ukrainian sort of operative, whatever it may be, and they actually threw a mine into the house of the Ukrainian forces that were situated there and just destroyed it entirely. The entire house, again, caused significant damage to it. And this is a recurring pattern. We're seeing now a lot of these Russian lone soldiers holding large explosive mines and throwing them with their hands into a window or something and just destroying the house completely, and doing so secretly. And so in this case, the soldier got concussion from just the massive explosive yield. But that's to show you generally where the Russians are operating right now. And the big threat is, first of all, the direct defense of New York, but then also the salients here, because they were fortified, they were structured, and now it just doesn't make sense to hold them if the Russians have this momentum just to the west. And you could see that also with the salient over here. Looking at Zaluzhny and Pivdenia directly east of Toretsk, very heavy urban battles as the Ukrainians didn't move in reinforcements. And so at least for the past 24, 48 hours, we have seen heavy clashes with the Ukrainians trying to stabilize the line. An area where they were unable to push back the Russians, and the Russians actually gained 700 meters of additional land through blocks in these Zaluzhny, or I guess Druzhba and Pivdenia suburbs. We could see that the extent of the Russian advance here was 400 meters, and then a bit further north, the Russians were able to advance all the way up to 600 meters. And so we see this based on proof from the 95th Brigade. They released a rather long compilation of just these various incidents of them shelling, whether it be through actual artillery shelling, mainly FPV drones, or these drones dropping grenades onto Russian soldiers individually, targeting them in windbreaks near the rail line where they've been advancing a lot recently, or within houses, or just out on the road. And this has been targeting the veterans PMC, which is one of the main units that is operating for the Russians in the attack here. And it consists of a lot of them in the PMC are actually citizens of the DPR right now. And so there are locals in the region, have been fighting here for a rather long time. And the Ukrainians, they also moved in an armored personnel carrier to fire directly towards the Russian positions, hold up within these houses to try to just fire through them and cause some damage, try to also cause them to retreat. And then you saw the Ukrainians send in a tank. That tank that advanced through the street and reached the marker over here. And at that point, it just started firing the cannon towards the Russian soldiers that were hiding within the houses, and just fired off a lot of shots towards them, trying to prevent them from solidifying control here. But the video does prove that the Russians now do have this sort of beachhead, bridgehead, whatever it may be, within the eastern suburbs. And it's not fully contained from the Ukrainian perspective, because the Russians are also advancing in this northwestern part of Druzhba. And so there is the possibility of the two vectors uniting and then just putting an overload onto the Ukrainian defenses, and then being able to push deeper and deeper into Druzhba, which is a big fear, because that would provide the Russians with this sort of northern flank to try to push southwards and undermine the Ukrainian defense that is set up through the center of Pivdenia, or pivnishny, I should say, in key areas like this slag heap. And it is important that they moved in the 95th Brigade because regardless of the Russian gains here, which have even happened under the 95th's purview, 95th Brigade has probably the best experience out of any of these units with repelling Russian assaults in the Maryinka area, for instance, because I saw just so many of those videos myself, especially their coordination with drone elements, which is something that I've seen lacking from the Ukrainian units here generally. They're not as experienced with these drone crews. They're not as good with combined arms of trying to coordinate various parts of the military to respond to attacks. And so it just makes sense for them to be moved in here. But I just don't see them on their own being enough to make a significant impact given how broad the front line is, as I previously described. But here you have a video from 28th Brigade, and they actually are using drones here. And in all the videos I've seen, including this one, they're dropping mines onto houses where the Russians are positioned. And so this case happened in northeastern Druzhba, and it confirmed a Russian advance, which we'll actually measure it here, amounts to something like 400 meters, 300 meters to the northwest. Now, looking at the Syrskyi salient, this is very interesting. The Russian MOD last week reported on the capture of Spirne, and I was aware of that. I just didn't mention it because I didn't see any sort of like proof of it. And now we actually do have proof of it, so it turns out those sort of claims were correct. I think it was the 123rd Motor Rifle Brigade that was involved in these attacks, because they have just been always, throughout all the videos I've seen, present in this region. They've been an integral role in the Russian attacks here. And so this video, it's geolocated to the western part of the hamlet, and the Russians raised the flags in one of the ruined houses. There has been fighting in Spirne back and forth. Sometimes the Russians captured it, sometimes the Ukrainians, sometimes partially. But for 2 years, over 2 years now, ever since the Russians captured Lysychansk and several Donetsk, and then pushed westwards into Verkhovno-Kamyanka, they got control over a very important ridge that basically envelops Spirne. And that was such a good forward base to overlook Spirne and its defenses and anything westwards. And despite that fact, because Spirne was a lower priority for the Russians, but also because of the tenacity of the Ukrainian defenders, for 2 years, it was not able to fall into the hands of the Russians. And this is one of the smaller villages that we've seen fighting through. But yeah, now the Russians, after numerous assaults, especially increasing this year, they have been able to overrun the Ukrainian defenses here, of which there are many. They are abundant in defenses, and they extend westwards into areas like Ivano-Darivka. And we can see some of it mapped over here in yellow. You can see it both in Ivano-Darivka and in Vimka. And you have defense here from the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade of the National Guard. And so that's the main unit here, but also a certain battalion of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade. So it's not a massive force, but they are dug in, and they have been for a while. So they're experienced with this sort of fighting. And now the Russian forces have an opportunity. They have a very strong sort of push occurring right now along the rail line towards Vimka and towards Ivano-Darivka from the south. And now they have this momentum coming in from the east. And both of those vectors are coming in from larger, higher ground positions overlooking the Ukrainian defense trenches, basically along the rail line or along villages on valleys. And so the Russians really do have an advantage in every sort of way that you could look at it, besides the fact that the Ukrainians had 2 years to dig in over here. And then the broader implication is that past Vimka and Ivano-Darivka, you just have these sort of various clusters of trenches before reaching, I guess, 6 kilometers to the south or to the northwest, finally reaching the southeastern portion of Syrskyi. And so this is a means by which the Russians can further galvanize in this area and actually put pressure on a different part of Syrskyi, not directly head on, but from the southeast, basically. Now, looking at the Luhansk Front, we now have Ukrainian sources discussing a Russian tactical success in the Makyivka area, where they were able to overrun the Ukrainian line of contact, and now there's fighting going on within the village itself. And so this will actually have broader implications if they're able to capture it, because then they'll have a way to cross over the Zherabets River. And once they do that, then there is a region just filled with open fields before the next sort of village in the area. If we measure it, it's about 5 kilometers to the west, and then the next unified line of defense is around 7-8 kilometers westwards. And by then, you're only, if you measure it, about 17 kilometers away from the Oskil River. And so the Oskil River depth here is rather good for the Ukrainians. They have a lot of land in between the Russian line and the actual sort of Oskar River chain of villages itself. But there was a warning from Deep State, I recall, like 3 weeks ago, where they were discussing potential Russian activation towards Borova. And I never really had time to read into it, but it does seem like there was some sort of plan by the Russians to send in forces here and at least in a local level try to push and try to advance slightly. And for that reason, perhaps just for general reasons of trying to close any gaps in the Luhansk line, after about 2 months of, I guess you could say, arrest for the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov, they were moved into the Luhansk Front. I don't think 2 months is accurate. I think it's more so like 1 month because they were really involved in the defense around Avdiivka, and then afterwards in the sort of Drona River engagements, trying to counterattack the Russian forces and then failing, and then trying to defend further westwards from the Drona River. And so they were involved in some of the really bloodiest fighting there at ground zero. And so they did have like a month where we didn't hear much from them. And then they were moved to this lower intensity part of the front line around June 20th as well. And they've been here ever since. And basically, since then, they've sort of acted as a way to disincentivize the Russians from attacking in the broader Makiivka area. But despite that fact, and despite the fact that you also have support from the 66th Mechanized Brigade here, it wasn't enough to prevent the Russians from pushing through and actually entering Makiivka. And they did so utilizing 2 of the following regiments, the 488th Motor Rifle Regiment, and if we could click on it over here, the 254th Motor Rifle Regiment, or the unit is located over here, and they're both a part of the 144th Division, which I have also marked somewhere in this region. And so, yeah, they're the 2 units that are involved in this particular push. And so definitely keep an eye out for whether they're able to cross the river and then put pressure onto whatever Ukraine holdings are actually still east of the river in areas like Nevske and perhaps even further south. Now, looking at Vovchansk, there haven't been significant changes here, but there is still a very heavy urban battle going on. And there are a few specific Ukrainian units that are at the forefront of this, and they have been releasing footage that I want to look at. So first we have this video from the 57th Brigade's Morchiki unit drone element from July 5th, where they showed themselves dropping mines onto the apartment complex. And of course you need mines. Grenades won't really do much to penetrate through a lot of the apartment slabs within the buildings. And so they're using mines that have a high explosive radius in comparison, trying to target Russian soldiers here. And the overhead view does show us that there is just an insane amount of destruction, especially in these northern sections of the apartment complex. I would say it's not still at the level of the Canal District, where we saw just entire apartments having certain portions just chopped off or flattened and just massive destruction all around. It's reaching that point here, and it will reach that point eventually, especially as the Russians increase the amount of shelling here with TOS-1A, for instance, or they just continue dropping fabs in the region. And that's something that's going to happen as the Russians try to press through this region, which they've made a priority, as we see through these certain videos. And they're trying to establish a foothold within these northern apartments. And in a lot of cases, they're just really in a massive amount of ruin. I don't want to exaggerate and say they're completely destroyed, because there's a reason why the Russians are still trying to occupy them. It's because they have a certain local significance, because even if a lot of them are in ruins, they still do have a certain height advantage. They have the general protection that gives you cover, even if it doesn't look like it did before the war started. And so yeah, there is still heavy fighting over this region, and the 57th Brigade is resisting any sort of Russian advance here. And so it is just turning into a very, very slow advance, methodical process from one apartment to another. And then just further south over here in the Vovchansk aggregate plant, we have footage that was released from July 5th of a soldier from the Lyut Brigade, which is one of these national police units, and an experience that I talked about a lot at the time around Klishivka in the Ukrainian counterattack over there. And it actually did have success in that regard before, of course, having it and the rest of the Ukrainian garrison being pushed out from Klishivka last month. But Lyut does have experience in engaging with Russians and actually attacking. And so it would make sense for them to be the unit to do this, but it is a soldier of a Lyut individual pushing through the southern parts of the aggregate plants. I think he's on his own in the video, but he's just, firing his gun and throwing grenades and whatever it may be. And so that should show you the general location of where the Ukrainian forward assault elements are as they try to squeeze the Russians out of the plant, not just from the corridor to the west, but also directly through it in the southern region. Although it's not any sort of massive foothold, and you do still have Russian forces connected here. And their biggest threat, of course, is the means by which they get supplied through the corridor being under constant fire, and a lot of it is coming from FPV crews. The Russians' sources here have noted definitely that there is a strong Ukrainian FPV presence whenever they try to leave the buildings within the factory. And so that's definitely something that's within their consideration. And then the final thing I want to say is regarding Khliboke, because we have now footage which was released, I think it's July. I don't know why I don't have the marker here, which is annoying me. I don't have the descriptor, but I think it's from July 6th. And from July 6th, it shows a compilation from Russia's 155th Naval Infantry Brigade. And this was a unit that previously operated around the Novomykhailiva area for a very long time, like half a year. And so definitely it did receive a couple of weeks of rest before moving here. But it has been moved relatively quickly back to the front line. And now it's engaged actually in forward shelling, because they released this video where they fired off a self-propelled howitzer towards the Ukrainian positions in Khliboke, whether it be in the southern portion over here of the houses in the village, or either in the warehouse area further north where I have this geolocated marker. And that does raise questions about whether the Russians are even in Khliboke anymore after over a week or 2 weeks of Ukrainian sustained pressure from many axes, whether it be from the southeast, directly from the south, directly from the west, utilizing Bradleys, utilizing infantry, trying to engage within the approaches of the first houses and being pushed back initially. And so there is a possibility that there no longer are Russian forces here, but we do have to verify it, because there is still a certain amount of land within the village which perhaps is under their control, but we don't have proof going one way or the other. So we are waiting to see. But it would also be important because Khliboke is the forward operating node for the Russians, which they would have used to then advance further southwards and undermine an area like Liptsy. And so that's why the Ukrainians have been so gung-ho on taking over this area, and it would be an even bigger benefit for them if they could retake these fortifications built along the warehouse region. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.